And during my tenure as Undersecretary of State, I appeared twice on call-in shows. We have a 1-hour call-in show every day where we are getting calls into Washington from Iran. And it's a very spirited dialogue. Most of these calls are quite favorable to the United States. And there's a lot of communication that's going on. We brought the Iranian basketball team here to practice in Utah before the Olympics. So I think there are a lot of ties between the Iranian people and the American people, and I hope that President Obama will be talking about that. And if there are ways that we can help the Iranian people, that would be that could go a long way toward peace. But the Iranian nuclear threat is a very, very serious one.
Mr. Glassman, I was pleased to hear you talk about person-to-person diplomacy and your role in it at the State Department. I'm on the board of the local Cleveland Council of World Affairs, and I'm very involved in the International Visitors Program.
Great.
And I think it's a very important, in traveling in Europe with some of the visitors, we found that what you said is true, that people respect the United States as a country or as a society. They may distinguish from the government at certain times. My question is, what do you think the balance is between using your new technology to expand the grand conversation and the person-to-person visits that have been the historic basis of it? You know, now we can do them electronically, clearly, but I think there's still obviously great advantage. The other question is that those kind of activities clearly are a lot less expensive than major military campaigns or a lot of other things we spend in our government. You know, we don't spend as much on foreign relations as we probably should.
Well, very good question. The International Visitors Program, and thank you for your help on that, is just a great program. We bring 3,500 foreign people to the United States, many of them sort of up-and-coming figures, young people who we think are on the way up, and we've done pretty well in figuring out who those people are, because there have been more than 200 heads of state that have participated in the International Visitors Program, including Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Hamid Karzai, many, many others. There's no doubt that face-to-face diplomacy, the putting an American together with someone from a foreign country, is absolutely the best thing we can do as far as improving America's relations with the rest of the world. The problem is, and let me also say that my predecessor, Karen Hughes, did an excellent job of getting the budget increased for that. So we had a terrible period during the 1990s when on a bipartisan basis, there were massive cutbacks in these programs. Now we built them back during the Bush administration to where they were and actually beyond. But still, we're not talking about a lot of people. You know, there's 6.5 billion people in the world. So we do 50,000 exchanges, including the International Visitors Program, where we used to do 35,000. We're still missing well over 6 billion people. So what I tried to do with my assistant secretary, who was terrific, Goli Ameri, who's an Iranian American, was figure out ways to amplify what we're doing. And a lot of that is electronic. But is it a substitute for face-to-face communication? No. And I am a strong believer in increasing that. And your comment about budget is absolutely on point. You know, we spend about $800 million on our entire public diplomacy program in the State Department. About 2/3 of that is on exchanges. Well, you know, figure it out. Figure out what an F-22 costs. And I'm not saying we don't need a strong defense. We absolutely do. But I do think that this administration, especially, should take steps to approach spending on public diplomacy and strategic communications so that it's the same kind of approach that we take on other elements of national security, such as the military side.
Mr. Glassman, you spoke about the desirability of a level field regarding competition among communications companies. And my question is to the desirability of having a same level field on trade agreements with foreign countries, because many of the trade agreements that we have do not require the foreign company to meet the standards that American companies have to have in the way of minimum pay, in the way of wages, environmental rules. As a result, there's really not a level playing field. To what extent do you think there should be some renegotiation now of those trade agreements to achieve a level playing field?
Well, thank you for the question, and happy birthday. You know, I am a staunch advocate of free trade, meaning that if it were up to me, there'd be no barriers to trade anywhere. There'd be no barriers. The Chinese would not have barriers to our goods. We would not have barriers to their goods. You know, there would be a free flow of trade. I actually am such a fanatic on this subject. I actually think that there's a moral principle involved. In other words, if I want to sell the sweat of my labor to somebody, to you, I have a right to do that. And my belief is I have a right to do that to anyone in the world. If I want to make that sale, there should not be government obstacles in the way. And if I want to make a purchase, there should not be government obstacles in the way. Well, the world doesn't exactly work that way, but I think that would be beneficial to everyone. So the problem in trade has always been, how do you kind of coerce the people who have erected barriers against you to bring them down? And we have mechanisms to do that. They're not perfect mechanisms, but they're actually working pretty well. And most of those work through the World Trade Organization. Some of them work through bilateral agreements that we have with individual countries. Now, we can threaten countries, and we say, well, you know, if you don't lower your barriers, we can do it individually, then we won't. Then we will raise ours. But in general, historically, it hasn't worked particularly well. It works better if both parties cooperate. But I recognize the problem. I think you're absolutely right. But let me put in a plea here to the new administration. It's not next anymore. It's here and now. There are trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, that are languishing today that would benefit Americans and that would benefit important allies around the world. One of them is with Colombia. I mentioned Colombia. We have no better ally than Colombia in Latin America. An amazing country. I met with President Uribe, and what they have done against the terrorist threat there, what they have done against what's happening in other parts of Latin America, such as in Venezuela, they're a great ally. Another is South Korea, another great ally of the United States now for 60 years and more. Those bilateral trade agreements need to go through, and they will benefit both countries by lowering both of our trade barriers. And I would certainly like to see that happen. And at a time like this, you know, during the Great Depression, most economists agree that something that exacerbated the situation was the raising of trade barriers, starting with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. That prolonged the Great Depression, and we are beginning to see, just beginning, but it still is very worrisome, we are beginning to see the erection of trade barriers by countries around the world. I'll just give you an example or a statistic. The World Bank just came out with a report on this. In November, the G20, which is the group of the 20 largest nations economically in the world, met, as I'm sure you probably remember, in November on the economic crisis. They will be meeting again on April 2nd in London.